I'm Sheba and I'll be a host for today's session. Now I'm delighted to introduce our speaker, Selvaraju Murugesan, Senior Director of Data Science at Kovai.co. So Selvaraju Murugesan has over a decade of experience driving data science initiatives and AI strategy in both academia and the SaaS industry. Today, he'll share how AI agents discover, fetch, read, and use your documentation, along with practical strategies to structure your docs for better AI retrieval, reduce hallucinations, and use analytics to continuously improve AI ready documentation. If you have any questions during the webinar, feel free to drop them in the Q&A box and we'll make sure to address them towards the end of the session. With that, I'll hand it over to Selva. The stage is yours.
Thank you, Shiva. So let me walk you through what we're going to cover in this webinar, predominantly about how documentation are being served to AI agents and how they are actually consuming that documentation, and what are the things as a technical writer you should do in terms of content design to make it easy for the AI agents to read the documentation and act on it. The most important aspect in the agentic world is docs are executable right now. So the AI agents take all the docs, reads, loads into the context, and acts on them. So that makes technical writer jobs a lot more interesting, because right now the content accuracy and the quality of the content you serve to the AI agents must be accurate at that point in time, and then it's able to execute. So what we're going to cover in the next 30 minutes is talking about docs discoverability. Let's also go into the pre-AI and the post-AI age. And I'll also introduce the concept of llms.txt and the agentic behavior, and some tips on content writers, technical writers on making agent-friendly docs. Okay. So let's go back to how it was before the AI, during the internet era, where Google search engine predominantly dominated most of how we look for information, especially the doc side. So in the pre-AI age, most of our customers and prospects do not land on the exact documentation site because they do not know the direct URL. So what do they go? What do they do? So they go to any kind of search engine. In this case, predominantly it's Google. So they go to Google search, they put your product name or any of the troubleshooting they have with the existing features or anything like that, and they actually type it in. And if Google indexed your documentation site, then the documentation site link pops up in the first top 5 URL links, and people click on the link, they directly land on the exact documentation article in your documentation site, and they read the article. So this is the usual flow. And the most important thing here is, so they read the article, they stay inside your documentation site, which means any kind of analytics can be gathered because they are in the site, and you have all your telemetry system in place with Google Analytics or any other scripts you put in terms of mix panel or segment. They can send events, and you can actually track how people are actually reading. Okay, the main metric we actually look at is what's the page read time and where they are, and where are the, if you have Hotjar installed, then you can actually go and inspect the heat map of where they actually move the mouse and where are the things that I actually focus on and stuff like that. So that is the pre-age. So this is how the documentation discovery actually happened. But for that to happen, most of the technical writers are actually involved in the SEO. Okay, so they go to robots.txt, and then you include your sitemap, and you also do the search engine optimization called SEO. Okay, the typical thing you do is you go to the sitemap. The sitemap sometimes is in the root. Most of the sitemaps are in the root directory, and sometimes the sitemaps do not have the exact sitemap.xml. Sometimes it comes with sitemap underscore index.xml, and then they have to navigate to the next to get the sitemap. Okay, the sitemap, when you look at the sitemap, in this case, I'm just showing the sitemap for an English language, you can actually see the list of articles. Okay, there's a URL, and there's a last modified date, and then it goes on. By the way, this is the schema set by the W3C. Okay, almost all the websites in the world follow the standard, and then they actually expose robots.txt and sitemap.xml. Remember, as a tech writer, we used to do SEO, the search engine optimization. So we go and take each documentation article, add a meta description, meta title, and then meta description, so that that appears in the snippet in the Google search. Okay, so what I'm actually highlighted in this is what you actually put in your documentation site, and that is actually helping the customers and prospects when they put in a search keyword, get a small snippet, read through it, and then they know this is the right link they should click. Okay, and we have done so much upskilling in terms of the SEO, even though most of the SEO are actually focused on the marketing. As a tech writer, we picked up that skill and we did it. Okay, and this is all pre AI age. Now, welcome to the new age where the SEO is almost dead. Most of the customers or users these days do not go to any kind of search engine. They go and use one of those AI assistant tools, like Claude, ChatGPT, Gemini, Mistral, you name it. Okay, there are a lot of AI assistant tools out there, and that's what most of the customers actually hanging out. Okay, and the famous thing from Gartner predicted that by 2026, almost 30% of the traffic do not come because they are all captured by the assistant. In fact, the effect is even more worse. Okay, so right now, all your documentation site is actually being visited by Claude using a tool called Webfetch or Web Search. In case of OpenAI, their ChatGPT ecosystem, they use Firecrawl or a Fetch MCP server. And in Cursor, they also use a bunch of MCP tools to do a web search and then find your relevant documentation link. Okay. But then the most important thing is, how do they actually land on that? Okay. So if you go to Claude Code, this is a very open prompt inside the Claude Code I've actually given. I wish to build an integration with Document360, find the API reference for getting an article. See, the first thing it actually invokes, because you've given an open prompt. This is like going to search engine and then putting a keyword. You're going into Claude Code, you have some idea, and you put in those prompts. Okay. The first thing it'll actually invoke is something called web search. It does the web search in a very agentic manner. Then it actually brings up the link. So if you look at it, it actually brought up a link and then the URL. Okay, that's the main function of web search tool, which is inside Claude Code. Then Claude Code uses another tool called Webfetch. The input for the Webfetch tool is an URL. So you give a URL, then it goes as it fetches the content from that particular URL. Then it summarizes and brings to Claude Code as a context. Okay, that's exactly what it actually does. Here is something you need to know. So if any of your documentation, if any of your customers actually using Claude Code and they don't know your doc site, it's not part of the skills and stuff like that, so they might do exactly what it did. So there's a problem with Webfetch tool. It uses Haiku model, which is it's very fast because you need to summarize and give it to the Claude Code, and it summarizes the content. Okay, and it has a limited context window as well, so it can only do up to certain number of tokens in the context memory. Here's the problem. So in the Webfetch tool, you have to feed the content in Markdown. Okay, I'll talk about it later. But if your entire documentation site is in HTML and many of your content has a lot of JavaScript in it, unfortunately, it will take all the HTML content to Webfetch, and it might scramble to find the content. Okay, most of the time your content is bloated with HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. Your content might be in the far end of or far tail of the HTML payload. It might miss the context window, the truncation window. So it might get truncated because of the context window limitation, and the Webfetch tool will never see your content, and it'll actually say to the Claude Code saying that, look, I can't find the content. And so that's the first content problem. And the second problem I've seen is not to do with the content type, but with the documentation site itself. Because when these Claude Code agents or bots visit the documentation site, your web server, your documentation web server, has a bot detection mechanism. It might think that it's coming from a bot and it might block it. Okay, so you got to be extremely careful to try and understand what kind of the traffic that's coming to your doc site. Because of the bug detection, it might be knocked down. And the third aspect is rate limiting. Most of the documentation web servers have rate limiting. If a lot of requests are coming from a particular server, a particular customer, from a particular URL, particular origin, it might be applying rate limiting to ensure that there's a fair policy applied. Okay. So because of that, there are times there where your documentation content is not served to the agents. So the way the Webfetch tool actually does this is through the moment the Webfetch tool hits your documentation site, it has few header parameters, and you have to understand. The first header parameter is called accept header. Okay. In the accept header, if you look at the PowerPoint, it comes with accept text/markdown, which means the Claude Webfetch tool is expecting a markdown content from your documentation server for the HTTP request to actually just submit it. If you're serving HTML, it will accept it, but it actually prefers a markdown content. If you're not serving the markdown content, it is not meeting its purpose. Okay, so that you got to remember that. And sometimes it also appends in the URL parameter. Question mark format is equal to markdown. Sometimes it also does this in the header X response format markdown, and these are the different ways where a Webfetch tool from Claude Code will request for a markdown content from your documentation server for a particular documentation article. If your documentation server is not serving the markdown content, then there's a problem. I already mentioned, if it's serving HTML and then you have a lot of JavaScript, it doesn't get to see the content at all. Cleverly, some of the AI assistants have tried. They try to also make up some URL. It also hallucinates. That's something you have to be very aware of. But sometimes it also intelligently adds .md to the slug. Try to see whether your documentation server actually serves some markdown content. So let me give you a bit of a demo. Here you see I have an AI security policy. This is one of the article from Document360, and then I can actually put .md, and then you can see that we actually serve the markdown content. Okay, this is very different to the HTML content you see here. So in the view source, if you look at it, it's all HTML content. Okay, so the first word is here. Let me search for this cryptography. So if you're serving this whole content as a HTML, okay, the whole content is in that 2305th line, or maybe it's a 2003. Yeah, see, it has to truncate. It has to see all this content, and then you're in that 2000 line, then the content actually appears. Okay, it's extremely hard for a Webfetch tool to actually know this content. Okay, so that's why it's very important to serve this content in the markdown file. So they introduced it was just a proposal, okay, called llms.txt. This is done by an Aussie, Jeremy Howard. And he proposed this format called llms.txt. Every single website should have llms.txt. He created this format specifically for surfacing your docs content or your website content to all this AI assistants, so that, for example, your Gemini and Perplexity and Claude, so that it can actually hit the llms.txt, get all the context of your doc site or your website, so it can be used for answer generation. So that is the main purpose this was proposed. And this proposal also says that you have to put llms.txt in the root directory of your documentation or your website. Okay, again, this was just a proposal. And then a lot of the documentation tech writing community, they jumped on it, okay, because it's a cool way for a documentation discovery point of view for the AI agents. Okay, so llms.txt can be used as a kind of a documentation index, and it can serve content. It can also serve the index to all the AI assistants like Claude and ChatGPT. And llms.txt mandates that you serve markdown content. So when whatever that's in llms.txt, you actually give all the index, and then the index points to all the markdown version of your documentation article. And he also proposed llms.txt-full.txt, which is like, it just not contains a bunch of indexes, article and then the article URL. It also contains the entire content itself in Markdown. Okay, so you can imagine if you have huge documentation article, I'm pretty sure the llms.txt -full.txt will be like few hundred megabytes of data. Okay, and that's a big file. Just to iterate that llms.txt is not endorsed by W3 World Wide Web Consortium. It's just a proposal that's still out there, but it's been picking up momentum in terms of adoption. So basically, the format for llms.txt is very simple. It's also in Markdown. So you have a title, and then you have a section. Basically, you put a link title, the URL, and then some kind of a description around it. Very simple and elegant format. Okay, it's just a documentation index. So if you look at it for our own documentation website, in our doc site, we also have llms.txt. You can actually see we put knowledge base, and you can actually see it from here. It says getting started, so it's a bit of a article title, and then you have the URL, and then you can also leave a bit of a description as well. Okay, so the typical format is article title followed by the link or the URL to the article, your documentation article, along with a short description. Okay, so this is when AI agents do the web search, or if you have a URL to your doc article directly, they will search for llms.txt to get the complete index of your documentation site. Okay, they're all pre-programmed or pre-trained, or maybe they have skills files that says go and look for llms.txt at the root directory, and they will do that. Okay, and the most important aspect is in every single article that you serve it to the AI agents, you need to include the documentation index. Okay, in this case, if you look at it, I'm hitting this subfolder with the accept parameter text/mark, and you can actually see that we actually point out to where the llms.txt is, so you can actually go and discover other content from it. Okay, extremely important in terms of your documentation discoverability point of view. And you got to be very careful when what you actually put into your LMS. Let's say you have a URL in the llms.txt, but it is redirects to some other thing. Okay, and you forgot to update the llms.txt. So when the AI agents hit the llms.txt and find the URL, and then it hits the URL, but then it redirects to something else, same host redirections are allowed. Cloud code in this will trust that. But if you have a cross domain, then inside your cloud code, you'll actually seek your permission. Look, there is a redirect in the doc side is coming. It's pointing to this, and I'm going there. Is it okay for me to go and do the Webfetch? And then it seeks your confirmation before proceeding. Definitely broken links are not acceptable as well. So let me give you a good demo. Use my Claude, and then I'll go into this incognito mode. Let me show you. So it's pretty cool when you play with these kind of tools and then try to understand what it actually look at the behavior. Okay, so let me share. So you can actually see this is my Claude desktop, and I am in incognito mode. Okay, and I'm typing. Okay, you want to know about Document360 Drive. Okay, let me ask very specific about. You want to know more about AI settings in Document360. Refer. Yeah. So let's see what it's actually trying to do. Okay. So now it's thinking about it. Now it's trying to find the tools. Oh, okay. So I've actually connected an MCP server, so it's actually trying to do the MCP. Okay, gosh, sorry. Since I've connected to the MCP server, it's actually picked up the MCP. I'm really sorry. So let me kill that, and then maybe I will create another Claude session. Let me go and copy that. I'll share another session in the. So let me go here, and then I will give the same prompt. Okay, let's see what it's actually trying to do. So it's trying to look up. Okay. Oh, boy. It's trying to do the MCP search again because I'm connected to the MCP. This is so you can actually see from there. Yeah. So basically, it will try to fetch the article. Then go and read the your documentation index from llms.txt, and then it'll actually does the search, find the right article, and do it. Okay. Now here is something important you should know. When the agent hits your documentation link and then reads the Markdown version, it reads and then disappears. Okay. It doesn't stay on the site like a human reader would do. It leaves little traces, by the way, in terms of the header parameters that it can actually capture. And the most important thing is it takes your content, puts it into the context, and then trying to execute the docs. Okay, here is an example. This is one of the traces I was able to pull from our documentation server. You can actually see this comes from Electron, so which means somebody is using Visual Studio Code to come and access our documentation site. It's an important thing for analytics. So we built a small analytics dashboard, so you can actually see how much agent requests are coming. We are able to differentiate the agent traffic from the human traffic, because human traffic usually originate through HTTP via browser, which leaves a lot of footprint. But the agent traffic comes with a specific indicator like user agent, and there are a bunch of header parameters actually leads. So we can actually definitely segregate the human traffic from the agent traffic. Okay, and that's how we actually separate it. And then we actually collect in terms of how much traffic it actually get, what are the distinct agent that hits your documentation site. Okay, and here's the most important thing. We also can give you in terms of what types of where the content is actually originating and what kind of article it is actually reading. Okay, what I observed is there are a lot of spikes happening in terms of how the agents read your doc site. In one go, a lot of things are actually hitting your site and then reading your content. This might be due to you release a new API endpoint, and then every single developer of your platform is interested, and then they spin up Cloud Code to access your doc site. Okay, and it's very important as a technical writer to know, because you know what kind of article you need to focus and what kind of needs to be kept highly accurate. Before I take up the questions, I want to share with some content tips. Yeah, this is pretty cool. You understood the importance of llms.txt and ensure that it is hosted on your root directory. And I also talked about how the Webfetch tool works for Cloud Code. As a content writer, this is something you need to test before you take the llms.txt live. Okay, the first aspect is, given that most of if your content is in Markdown, no problem. There's nothing to worry about. But for human readability, we would have added a lot of interactive elements. For example, we would have added tabs, accordions, and stuff like that. And you got to make sure that whatever that's in the HTML, when it's converted into a Markdown format, there's no content loss. Okay, I have witnessed that there are a lot of different configuration and procedures for different operating system written in tabs in HTML, and it didn't translate well into Markdown. Okay, and because of that, the agent failed to find the right content. Okay, so that's extremely important. The second is, you need to have, if you're having any kind of code samples in your documentation, make sure they are working. Okay, you can't put something that is that is wrong in syntax and calls different API endpoints and stuff like that. That is not acceptable. So you probably heard this is called zero-step prompting. So it's very important to actually give some examples to the AI coding agent that it actually follows that. Okay, so have working samples. So when you're doing some user guide, for example, if you're doing step-by-step procedure, instead of having lots of screenshots and adding a lot of interactive elements like GIFs and videos, have those steps spelled out in a very simple steps, okay, in text format. Okay, it's extremely useful for the AI agents to act on the content. Okay, and given that I already talked about the analytics side, so if you know what kind of agents are visiting your bot through the visiting your documentation site, then you will know what kind of characteristics of that particular tool. For example, in this case, if you're using Cloud Code, the Webfetch tool has a context window limitation, and based on that, you can actually fine-tune the content length for the particular article. Okay, so it's very important. I have seen a lot of technical writers actually tweaking the content based on the type of bots it's actually visiting. Okay, and they also try to discover the dark contents out there which has never been used by AI agents, and then trying to understand why it is not being used. And the other aspect is, I always curate the business terms and then have some kind of a glossary part of that article, so that you have all the terminologies and everything explained in the one single article. Again, Google is also trying to release something called open knowledge format that actually bundles up a lot of these things I've talked about in a nice Git repo, where your agents can actually use that Git repo right away. Again, that okay, open knowledge format is evolving, and only time will tell whether it will take off or not. But till date, it's all llms.txt and stuff like that. And if you're a Document360 customer, we actually support llms.txt, and your website is completely compliant with for agent discoverability. Okay, and we support and we tested with all the AI agents, AI assistants, and coding agents out there, and is able to see your documentation index and be able to use your content. Okay, that's pretty much what I have, and I'm happy to take any questions. Yeah, Shiba, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Selva. The session was quite insightful, and I'm sure the audience will agree. So before we move on to answering the questions from our attendees, I have a few post-webinar poll questions for you all. So I'm going to launch it for you. So yeah, will you test your doc index in an AI assistant like Claude Code, Codex, or Cursor? Whether you will test it soon or you're not planning to test it, or you have already testing it now. Please feel free to share your inputs, everyone. Okay, now let me launch the second poll for you all. Here you go. So which takeaway will you act on first? Whether to add or improve llms.txt, or whether to write self-contained pages, or whether to set up agent analytics, or to re-architect for agent access. Okay, here's the final poll for you all before we jump onto the questions. So how would you rate the knowledge you gained? Whether you learned a lot, or you learned a fair amount, or you learned a little, or nothing new for me. Okay, thanks for sharing your responses. Okay, Selva, so few of our attendees have shared their questions and I'll read them to you now. So there is a question from Anne. Is Document 360 building its functionalities like tables, accordions, code blocks, etc. in such a way that I can be sure that the LLMs can read them?
So if you are with Document360 ecosystem and you're using those rich UI elements, there is no content loss when we convert anything from your those rich HTML into Markdown. We internally as a platform, we take care of that. So there's no content loss. So if you're using tabs, accordions, and any other things, your content is safe. There's no content loss between HTML and Markdown.
Thank you, Silva. Moving on to the next question from Tom. This seems very useful for established knowledge bases that are not creating new articles often. However, if you are new to the scene and are creating tens to hundreds of articles, you would be spending just as much time creating new text files. How often should you be updating the llms.txt file?
Yeah, look, you can create on your own, or you can automate this process. Okay, for example, if you're with Document360, we automatically build the llms.txt for you. TXT for you. So as soon as you create a new article, it's already added to the llms.txt automatically if you're with a platform like ours. But having said that, it's not going to stop you if you're using any kind of other open source tools and stuff like that. You can write a small Python script. Whenever you add, you just append one more row into the .txt. The most important aspect is in terms of the control you need to have over the llms.txt. A lot of the platform providers, they actually generate the llms.txt, but you have no way to edit it. Okay, but in terms of Document360, we actually give you a kind of flexibility inside the Document360 portal where you can actually go and edit that description. Okay, that description is what makes the AI assistants like Claude Code try to understand what this article link is all about. Okay, if you have like 10 articles written on the same topic, that description actually matters. Okay, so we give you that kind of flexibility, but you can also build a small kind of a Python script to update the or create the LMS from all your documentation content. It's just an index, so it should be straightforward to do that.
Thank you, Selva. There is a follow-up question from Tom. So what service would you recommend to take out articles and convert them to Markdown?
Yeah, look, converting content to in any format to Markdown is definitely a debatable one. The reason is there are a lot of packages out there that says that it is converting without any content loss. Again, you have to go and test them in full and then convert it. But I personally recommend a lot of technical writers to write the content in Markdown format because that's the universal kind of format for the AI world at the moment.
Thank you, Silva. So there is another follow-up question from Tom. He's asking, how do we access it within Document360?
Look, sorry, lost for a while. So you go to your root directory of your documentation site. In this case, for example, if you're whatever domain you have, and then at the end of the domain you have append llms.txt and it'll actually give you the list of that's the llms.txt file. There you go.
Thank you, Selva. Moving on to the next question from Eric. So will you also support a full .text from Document360?
Yeah, look, currently we do not support -full.txt for few reasons, but we are discussing about a good roadmap in terms of how to implement that. I'll give you the reason that's actually happening internally is, let's say you have thousands of articles, and then it's easy to produce llms.txt because it's just an index, and it's only, if you look at the size of the file, it's only few kilobytes or at the maximum 1 megabyte. But if you're creating -full, which means it not only contains your article, the link, it also contains the content of the article itself. And you have, if you have thousands of articles, putting them into one file is not a good solution. Okay, that will be in megabytes. If you host that in the root directory, when the HTTP comes in, it might time out. We might host it, but when it pulls the content, it might time out. Your web client might time out. And we are also thinking in terms of can we split that and things like that, and then we can actually store the index somewhere. We are actually architecting a good solution, but currently we are not supporting llms-full.txt. Okay, but to be honest, you just need llms.txt. Your Webfetch tool can go and read the relevant content. You don't need the entire content unless you are a vendor trying to train your large language model, and in one hit you need the entire content. Okay, but most of the LLMS vendors, they have a bot that actually crawls the llms.txt and then goes and does the web fetch and fetch the content separately.
Thank you, Selva. Moving on to the next question from Aaron. Why does a docu page need llms.txt when it is already marked down and easy understandable by AI?
Look, if you, so if you're, okay, that's a fantastic question. So let's say your documentation set already has an HTML and then also supports Markdown. Cool. But where do you store the index? Where is the index for an AI assistant to know what are the contents you have? Okay, it's more like you go to a restaurant and you need to have a menu. Okay, you need to know what kind of food they serve and where they're actually serving. And the menu is your llms.txt. It needs to know what and where it is, and that actually helps the AI agents to find the right land on the right article. Okay, that's extremely important. And also knows what are the other relevant or similar articles it can actually use in the subsequent context window. Okay, so that's exactly the purpose of it. Shiba?
Thank you, Selva. Moving on to the next question from Bhumesh. So as mentioned, Document360 has llms.txt embedded. Does that mean we can search any article using Claude Document360 MCP server and search the published articles?
Yeah, look, the llms.txt is very different from the MCP server. Once you have an MCP server, you have access to the content. The MCP server doesn't need an llms.txt because it has a lot of tools to do the search internally. Okay, if you're coming from Claude or ChatGPT and you're not connecting documents to MCP server, that's exactly where the llms.txt comes in. Okay, this is for wide range of public users who can actually use the llms.txt to find the right article. Remember, to use the MCP server, you need to be authenticated. Okay, if you're a public reader, do not have accounts with Document360 or your project, they can't access the MCP server, access your content through MCP server. Yes, Shiva.
Thank you, Selva. Yeah, moving on to the next question from Gilbert. Does this mean that a sample of LLMS is already configured for our knowledge base since we are using your Document360 platform?
Yeah, that's correct. So you can go and try, just put your URL, your documentation URL, and at the end of the URL, you just append llms.txt, and then you will get it. Just remember, we only do it for the public site. If you're a private site, we don't, because that's your private content and we can't index that. Okay, only available for public knowledge base only.
Thank you, Selva. Moving on to the next question from Chris. So how do AI agents prioritize llms.txt over sitemaps or robots.txt when discovering documentation?
Yeah, look, they actually go and look at your root directory and then try to find llms.txt. That's the behavior they exhibit in right now. They don't go into your robots.txt or sitemap. Though they never do that. They either go to the llms.txt directly, or they might hallucinate with a makeup URL and then try to access that. In most of the case, it will get 404. But I'm 100% that did a research and then evaluated a lot of these things. They go and look for documentation index at llms.txt. So that's the behavior they're actually exhibiting at the moment. Okay, so it's not, it's essential for many of the documentation site to have llms.txt in their root directory.
Thank you, Selva. Moving on to the next question from Mary. How should documentation be structured if we don't have an llms.txt file?
Yeah, look, it got nothing to do with content restructuring. llms.txt, you can think about the as a index. You know, when you take a book and you want to find a particular keyword or something, there's always an index at the end. Okay, using that index, you find the right page and you find the right content. llms.txt is that index. Okay, it tells you the list of articles, their URLs and small description, so that your AI agents can read the llms.txt and then trying to understand the whole landscape of your documentation, and then it actually knows which article to fetch based on the user prompt, okay, in the AI assistant or the coding tool that your customers are using. So that's what it is. In terms of the content structure, right, in the markdown format, you follow the right kind of guidelines. You know how to put it in H1, H2, and then those are the good old tech writing practice that you have to follow.
Thank you, Selva. That is a question from Aaron. So you don't do it automatically for private sites because AI can't access it anyway?
No. Look, for private if your knowledge base is private, which means you do not want anybody to come and sniff on your content. It's behind a paywall. It's behind a security. Okay, we don't do that. In fact, if you go to any kind of, it's a security problem, and then why would you want AI assistant to know the documentation index anyway? I mean, these are like behind your security login. Okay, for a private site, we don't do it. For public site, yes, and we can actually test it.
Thank you, Selva. Moving on to the next question from Neetu. So how does this approach differ when documentation is exposed through MCP servers instead of web pages?
Yeah, look, again, the MCP server, for an MCP protocol, most of the MCP server out there, they prefer OAuth, okay, which means you need to be a authenticated user in their platform to use their MCP server. For example, if you're a Document360 customer and we give an MCP server to your project, which means you need to have a project account, or your readers need to have a project account to use the MCP server to access your content. Okay, that's how you use the MCP system. But assume that they do not have the MCP server. But then how do they access your content? They can go to ChatGPT and then type your product name or a feature name and say, hey, find me the content. Tell me how to integrate my API with this product feature. Then ChatGPT or Claude go and look for the llms.txt, reads all the index, and know this is the article it has to go and read for the user prompt that you're actually given, invokes the Webfetch tool, hit that URL, get the markdown content, bring that content into the context window, and acts on it. So that's how it actually works.
Thank you, Selva. Moving on to the next question from Shashank. If our documentation is private, what do we need to do to make our documentation llms.txt ready?
Look, if it's private, I'm actually questioning, why do you want the public agents to go and see your private content? Just use the MCP server so that only the trusted user can see and discover your content. Okay, if it's a private, why do you want the public user to see your private content? That's a bit of a contradicting scenario, right? If you want the whole world to see it, make your site public. If it's private, keep it private, and only the authenticated users can see it through MCP server, not through llms.txt. llms.txt is a public documentation index for all the assistant who are not authenticated users to go and see your content and use your content. And yeah, clear? I think I made it very clear.
Yeah. So yeah. So there is another question from Aaron. So but is there an MCP only for readers?
Yeah. Look, there is an MCP only for readers, but if you are in Document360, when you go through MCP server, whatever access control permission you have for readers also apply for the MCP server. for the MCP server as well. So which means, let's say you have a particular article that can be only read by a particular reader group, then through MCP server, they can only read that. They can't read any other stuff, any other article that you have. So all the access control permissions in the Document360 flows into the MCP server as well.
Thank you, Selva. Moving on to the next question from Laura. So how do AI agents decide which page to retry when multiple articles cover similar topics?
Brilliant. So that's exactly remember I was talking about the description. Okay. You will have similar topics, but what you can control as a tech writer is the description. Okay, goes against a particular article title and its URL. The description is the tech writer can control inside the Document360 portal. If you have 10 topics, let's say you have getting started, you have configuration, you have troubleshooting and stuff like that, go to the LMS, go into the portal and then edit that llms.txt meta column inside Document360 for the particular article. Then your llms.txt is updated. Okay, but we automatically generate description. Okay, but you can also go and edit it, and that's exactly how you can actually make the AI agents aware of the scope of different types of content you have, and it can actually use it on the need basis.
Thank you, Selva, and that's a wrap for today's session. Once again, a huge thank you to you for walking us through the topic. And of course, if you have more questions or want to learn more about Document360, then feel free to reach out to us. We'll be back soon with another session. Until then, see you next time. Thank you, Selva, and thank you everyone for joining.